Welcome to Vanadium. I'm Chris Rankin. The more I learn about this mad world, the more mysterious it seems. A question arrived to my website, ChristopherRankin.net, about a chemical called Adrenochrome, asking whether I thought any of the modern legends were true, whether I bought into the recent hype that it's an underground cult drug used by the Illuminati to see into other dimensions and retain youth, that it's harvested from the adrenal glands of terrified children and worth a fortune on the black market, and that recently a bunch of celebrities caught the COVID from a contaminated batch of adrenochrome. The fanfare surrounding this reddish crystal is next level. Adrenochrome is a chemical with its own lore. Chemically, it seems pretty unremarkable. A reddish pink crystal containing no chromium whatsoever. An alkaloid, meaning the adrenochrome molecule has a nitrogen atom strung in there. This is a common feature of many psychoactive compounds, but also a common characteristic of natural compounds overall. So what's all the fuss about? Is this infamous molecule more than just a combination of 4 chemical elements? If adrenochrome is somehow magic, then can it be synthesized? Or does it need to be extracted from people? If so, why? The organic synthesis behind it is straightforward. Adrenochrome and the precursors are inexpensive, readily available, and completely legal and uncontrolled. Why go through the trouble of kidnapping or killing anyone? So, I'll start at the beginning, when scientists first started playing around with the substance. Extracts of the adrenal gland were first obtained by Polish physiologist Napoleon Cybulski in 1895. These extracts, which he called natnerzyna, contained adrenaline and other catecholamines. This Napoleon Cybulski fellow wasn't your average scientist by any means. I'm planning an episode about this character for the near future. Cybulski came up with a process to extract the mix of adrenaline-like substances from the glands of animals. Although by all means a brilliant man, this scientist had, shall we say, a very gung-ho, take-no-prisoners approach to science. So he was able to extract this stuff. And some people put adrenal extract under their tongues for physical and emotional stress. Also for general fatigue, allergies, autoimmune disorders, depression, low blood sugar, and low blood pressure. In 1901, Takamine successfully isolated and purified the hormones adrenaline, adrenochrome, and others from the adrenal glands of sheep and ox. This is where chemists really started to get interested in this stuff. I'm going to read from the Biochemical Journal, and the year is 1937. This is volume 31, part 1, page 609. Adrenochrome is a very unstable substance. It is completely destroyed in 4 minutes by 1% hydrochloric acid, and in 40 seconds by 1% ammonia. At pH 7.3 and 37 degrees Celsius, the red color disappears in 35 minutes. And even under optimum conditions for keeping the solution, at pH 4.0 and 0 degrees C, the marked decomposition and melanin formation could be observed in 4 to 5 hours. In the dry crystalline condition, adrenochrome could be kept for several weeks, but on standing in a vacuum desiccator, it decomposed to give a brown amorphous product. The crystalline substance appears to be a hydrate. The crystals decompose on heating at about 120 degrees C. They go on. Adrenochrome is very soluble in water and crystallizes from water only on evaporation practically to dryness. It is readily soluble in methyl alcohol. It is removed quantitatively from the aqueous solution by adsorption on charcoal and can be eluted again from the charcoal with methyl alcohol. So this is when chemists really started to get good at playing with this stuff. And they also realized that adrenaline and adrenochrome have a subtlety in their molecular structure, something that makes them more complicated, something called stereoisomerism. Chemicals can be mirror images of one another, enantiomers as they're called, chemically the same in a lot of ways, but not superimposable, not direct copies. These mirror opposites don't always act the same way in the human body. They can fit into receptor sites and enzymes very differently. This is from the Journal of the Chemical Society from 1950. They're looking at one form, they call this the minus form of adrenaline, to show that it's just one of these enantiomers. 2 grams of adrenaline was suspended in 70 milliliters of water, and dilute hydrochloric acid was added dropwise with shaking until a clear solution was obtained. Silver oxide, 8 grams, was added. The mixture shaken vigorously for 5 minutes and then filtered. The aqueous solution of adrenochrome thus obtained was stable for about 12 hours at 0 degrees C. It didn't take much longer for scientists to take things up a notch, and one scientist certainly did. Abram Hoffer defined the science on the effects of adrenochrome. His 1962 book, The Effect of Adrenochrome and Adrenolutin on the Behavior of Animals and the Psychology of Man. I'll read from the introduction. The effect of adrenochrome upon simple systems will be considered first, then upon the more complex systems, upon simple animals, and finally, upon the most complex animal, man. The animals that have been given adrenochrome range from spiders, fish, and pigeons to the mammals, rats, cats, dogs, monkeys, and man. The section on cats and on man will include much original data. Activity in animals has been reported so frequently and consistently that it can no longer be doubted that adrenochrome is indeed active when given to animals. Activity in man has received less corroboration, but all the published accounts are corroborative. It would be remarkable for a compound to be so active in lower animals and mammals, but to be inactive in man. Hoffer determined the lethal dose for a mouse, the LD50, at 100 milligrams per kilogram. That's certainly something I would consider toxic. It's not VX, but it's also not something you want to get down with the way Johnny Depp did in Fear and Loathing. Hoffer tested adrenochrome on a wide variety of animals. One interesting case, spiders under the influence of adrenochrome produce disorganized and somewhat disturbing-looking web patterns. Other psychoactive drugs have been tested on spiders as well, and although the patterns in the webs do change when the spider is exposed to things like alcohol, cocaine, and LSD, the webs aren't affected the way they are with adrenochrome. The researchers found webs with patterns much more distorted and corrupted than with any other drug tested. In the 50s and 60s, adrenochrome was the focus of intense scientific investigation as the potential root cause for schizophrenia and other serious mental health problems. The doctors had the idea that adrenochrome was an oxidized and warped form of adrenaline that accumulates in some people due to a malfunctioning enzyme and causes hallucinations and breaks from reality. Its fame, mystery, and mythology have developed over the years, helped along by a few notable books and movies. The popular legend behind adrenochrome started in The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. Huxley writes, "Then came the discovery that adrenochrome, which is a product of the decomposition of adrenaline, can produce many of the symptoms observed in mescaline intoxication. But adrenochrome probably occurs spontaneously in the human body. In other words, each one of us may be capable of manufacturing a chemical, minute doses of which are known to cause profound changes in consciousness. Certain of these changes are similar to those which occur in the most characteristic plague of the 20th century, schizophrenia. Is the mental disorder due to a chemical disorder? And is the chemical disorder due, in its turn, to psychological distress affecting the adrenals? It would be rash and premature to affirm it. The most we can say is that some kind of prima facie case has been made. Meanwhile, the clue being systematically followed. The sleuths, biochemists, psychiatrists, psychologists are on the trail. This is probably where Hunter S. Thompson first heard about adrenochrome, when he decided to put it in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. When considering adrenochrome, it's helpful to remember that adrenochrome refers to two different things. One is a metabolite of endogenous epinephrine occurring spontaneously in the body. The second is a byproduct of metabolized pharmaceutical epinephrine. Endogenous adrenochrome has been widely researched for its possible role in schizophrenia. It is described as a hallucinogen or psychomimetic and as a cholinesterase inhibitor. Cholinesterase is one of the many important enzymes needed for proper functioning in the nervous system. Adrenochrome's history is intimately tied to its identity as a metabolite of epinephrine. In Canada, it is rumored that during World War II, supplies of fresh adrenaline sometimes ran short. In emergencies, when some patients had to be given adrenaline from old stock, adrenaline that had turned oxidized and slightly pink, they experienced temporary hallucinations. This effect is substantiated by product inserts in injectable epinephrine products, which warn, "Do not use if it is pink, brown, or contains a precipitate." Epinephrine is sensitive to light and air and is generally considered unstable. This takes me back to Abram Hoffer and his 1962 book. Now, I'm not a fan of animal experimentation, and although some of it is necessary, a lot of it isn't, and I've seen some striking examples of useless and cruel animal testing with adrenochrome in the 50s and 60s. And I'm talking about our man Hoffer. I'm not calling him a bad scientist, but just to give you an example of how unscientific scientists can be. BB the cat was one of the feline subjects given adrenochrome and a few other pharmacologically related compounds. The data the scientists came up with was nothing more than a ranking of how much they seemed to annoy BB on a given day. Most of the descriptions of BB's behavior while under placebo or under mind-altering drugs consisted of slightly varying levels of intense hostility. Abram Hoffer and his colleagues bothered this cat and other animals for pointless data that they should have been too embarrassed to write up and disseminate. So, moving on to the clinical studies with human subjects. Who else to test a dangerous and barely understood drug on? But a child, of course. How did people get away with this? Yeah, I kind of hate this guy, Hoffer. I'll just say it. You dig into science, you can find a lot of darkness. Here's a description of one of his experiments in a section titled Prolonged Reactions to Adrenochrome. The patient he's describing is a 16-year-old girl. Some of the changes produced by adrenochrome may persist several days, and in some cases the effects nearly led to disastrous results. Cases of prolonged reactions will be discussed. These experiences with adrenochrome have made us quite cautious with this drug, which seems to be so mild in its action, but which can be so dangerous because of the lack of insight it induces in some subjects. The subject in this experiment is called Miss FM. He writes, "This young female, age 16, had been well until age 8. For the next 2 years, she had unusual sensations in her chest and nose every night. A few weeks before this investigation, she developed changes in perception. Her mother's face seemed strange and altered as she watched. The visual field was covered with a checkerboard pattern. Her body image was different. Time moved very slowly, and houses looked like cornflake boxes. There was no thought disorder, but she was very apprehensive. For several years, she had been given Dilantin and phenobarbital for mixed petite and grand mal epilepsy. At the time of investigation, she was normal. The EEG showed very marked left anterior temporal focus characterized by high voltage, slow waves, and an occasional sawtooth wave with single spikes. The left temporal focus increased with hyperventilation. At the beginning of the EEG test, she was happy, cheerful, and friendly. She was given 50 milligrams of adrenochrome by vein. After 10 minutes, she developed a feeling of estrangement and fear, and her nose itched. The pathological activity of the temporal focus increased, and dysrhythmia became generalized. She was now morose, quiet, and depressed. When she was urged to describe how she felt, she cried. Then she reported that the strange feelings and disturbances in the body image, which had been present 2 weeks before, had returned. She was given 500 milligrams of nicotinic acid by vein, that's niacin. Within 15 minutes, the focus was less intense. The dysrhythmia had disappeared, and she was mentally normal. That evening at home, she was moody and quiet. 1 week later, she was very disturbed, and 2 weeks after the treatment required committal to a mental hospital. On admission, she suffered from perceptual changes. All faces were strange. There were marked déjà vu, feelings of estrangement, unreality, and visual hallucinations. She had thought disorder. Her present life was merely a show and a replay of a previous period in her life. She was confused, rambling, and almost incoherent, with delusions of guilt, and she was paranoid. Her mood was flat. The staff were not aware she had received adrenochrome. On admission, the diagnosis of schizophrenia was entertained, but with her history of epilepsy, she was finally diagnosed as having an epileptic psychosis. A few days after admission, her psychosis cleared, and a few weeks later, she had typical grand mal convulsions. These were controlled by anticonvulsant medication. She was in the hospital about 6 months. Over the next 6 years, she has shown no schizophrenic-like symptoms. Since the 50s and 60s, doctors and scientists are now in less agreement about the effects of adrenochrome. The common view now is that the stuff is bunk, just some slightly toxic, degraded form of adrenaline, certainly without any profound psychoactive effect. Still, there have been studies recently that suggest there is more to the story of adrenochrome. A good source on everything about the relationships between psychoactive chemicals in the body is erowid.org. I'm going to read one user's trip report, as they're called, about his repeated experiences with adrenochrome. This is called Killing the Myth, an experience with adrenochrome. And the experience took place in 2004, and this was published in 2006 by Gennaro, and his gender is male, and he doesn't give his age at the time of the experience. And this is where it gets interesting. He describes a 100 milligram sublingual dose, and he gives his body weight at 67 kilograms. And the compound used, he writes, the adrenochrome freebase with 99.98% purity. And he mentions using the racemate. So as I talked before about stereoisomerism, this trip report, the person who published this trip report, understands the difference between the two mirror images of the chemical. They also give the CAS number, which is something a chemist might do, 56-06-8. So Gennaro writes, adrenochrome has been described as a hallucinogen or psychomimetic and a cholinesterase inhibitor. It also has hemostatic properties, meaning that it has something that stops bleeding. Description of the powder. A close-up of the adrenochrome crystals shows a dark red color, but the powder seems just like dried blood to the naked eye, meaning some slightly orangey brown color. But if I dissolve some crystals in a few drops of water, I will get a blood red to bright red solution, depending on the concentration. Exactly the same color as mercurochrome. It has a slightly metallic chemical taste, which somewhat reminded me of the taste of blood, but it was much more tasteless, less bitter. The price. Most labs sell a racemate form of adrenochrome at around 70 to 100 euros for 250 milligrams. But I recently found another chemical supplier selling a product named adrenochrome at 110 euros for 50 grams. The price difference is so huge that I first thought it couldn't be the same compound that other suppliers were selling. But the CAS number was 56-6-8, so it's definitely the same adrenochrome. Such a price difference seems strange to me. I thought it could be that one of the two enantiomers instead of the racemate form. But this wouldn't be logical, as separating the two would be complicated, and therefore one enantiomer alone would be more expensive than the racemate. So I believe right about that. So he goes on. Adrenochrome is quickly oxidized and should be kept away from air, light, humidity, and heat. Therefore, it is kept in an airtight container which is put in the freezer. Even this way, it'll slowly decompose, so it should not be kept for too long before use. This is where the author goes on to describe his experience with the drug. First trial. I held 100 milligrams under my tongue for 1 minute and then swallowed. Fast onset, about 5 minutes. Second trial. I snorted 50 milligrams. Onset, a few seconds. Third trial. I smoked 25 milligrams, vaporized in a crack pipe. Onset is almost instant. Note that I waited a few days between each trial. The 3 trials gave me the exact same effects, which were very light and really uninteresting. I wouldn't even call it a high. First, it wasn't hallucinogenic nor psychedelic. I had a feeling of warmth through my body. I felt a numbness in my hands and my head, possibly linked to the hemostatic effect. There was some slight sedation, and a very short-lived euphoria. The euphoria was slightly more pronounced when smoked, but still short-lived. There's also some minor visual change. No visuals, just that I would see rooms slightly differently than usual. But honestly, that was really some minor change. A joint of hashish would do really the same thing. Nothing too noticeable. There might be some slight meiosis too, little pupils. Not really sure. To sum up, effects were extremely weak, absolutely not fun, nor psychedelic in any way, and short-lived. I would say the initial slight euphoria is gone within 4 to 5 minutes, and a few strange feelings that I would experience from the stuff are gone within an hour. I couldn't say the exact duration as I didn't really check my watch. Needless to say, I was very disappointed by this uninteresting compound. The effects I had from it were flimsy. There was a definite effect on my vision and my mental state for sure, but I would definitely not call it hallucinogenic. So I might have wanted to try higher dosages just in case this could intensify any effects. Let's say 250 milligrams orally, 100 milligrams snorted, or 100 milligrams vaporized. Or I might have wanted to try the other adrenochrome, the one sold at the higher price, just to make sure it's the same. But I didn't, as I had better things to do with my money. To conclude, I would say this is an uninteresting substance in my opinion, and furthermore, it's possibly a dangerous one. The research on adrenochrome is confusing and inconsistent, but there may be a simple explanation for that. It's possible that due to the sensitivity of adrenochrome to air and light, its instability, its stereoisomerism, scientists and hobbyists aren't able to keep the chemical compound they're studying consistent. As for the crazy stories, do I think this stuff is being harvested from children and used as the Eucharist in demonic masses? I don't see any real evidence for that. And if it is being used for dark illicit purposes, it's likely being extracted and processed or synthesized. Both being far lower risk methods than kidnapping or murder, even for elites with considerable influence and resources. However, I always leave open the possibility that I'm wrong. It happens to me all the time, and I'm trying to learn to like it. And one more thing. Talking about this, I'm reminded of the case of the black rhino. This animal has been hunted for centuries, recently to near extinction, primarily for the horn, which is ground down and taken for erectile dysfunction as a boner medication. Rhino horn contains 0 compounds that could ever do this, and study after study has shown this stuff to be total bunk in the boner department. Viagra has been available for decades, and everyone knows this stuff works as reliably as the most reliable drugs in the pharmacopeia. Viagra definitely works, and black rhino horn definitely does not. Still, rhinos are being hunted today for their horn, which people are willing to spend a fortune on and risk serious legal prosecution from obtaining or possessing. The poachers risk imprisonment or even death for hunting black rhino. Yet the demand is sufficient for these people to risk everything to obtain black rhino horn, something that does literally nothing. It's essentially dark fingernail clippings. Still, it doesn't stop some people. People still believe. Maybe there are people out there who really believe in adrenochrome. This is Chris Rankin with Vanadium. Thank you very much.